want to talk about food. According to the best estimates we have, around 870 million people around the planet are undernourished. This means they don't have the quantity and the range of food to sustain a normal and healthy life. It's about 1 person in 8 across the world. Now, we've always had hungry people in the planet. It's been part of the human condition for a great swathe of the population since time immemorial. So what's new, you might ask? Well, this graph tells a story. Over the past few years at a global level, our progress against hunger has been stalling. In the back end of the 20th century, we made great gains. And on this basis, the Millennial Development Goals were constructed with what seemed to be quite attainable targets for reducing hunger and undernourishment. Now, in this graph, the red line tells you where we'd be today had those targets been met. The blue line tells you where we actually are. Now, it mightn't look like much of a difference between the two lines, but this equates to what is an estimated 228 million more hungry people than would otherwise be the case. So what are we to do? Well, according to many people, the instinctive response to this should be to produce more food. Now, that's not unreasonable at all. We do have, and let me make this clear, some very urgent needs for more agricultural research. We have a growing world population. We have a finite planet with finite resources, and we have the challenges of climate change. But the message I want to leave you with today is that if we're serious about confronting problems of world hunger and doing the best by the hungry of the world, our prime objective should be to better understand their lives. We need to listen and learn. Now, why do I say this? Well, for the past 10 years or so, I've been doing research in a number of research projects in rural India. There are more undernourished people in India than in any other country of the world. This research, which has been funded through the Australian Research Council, has led me to a number of different villages and communities across India, and I've talked with a wide range of people. Now, I'm a geographer by training. Being a geographer means you ask, why is this so? You try and move beyond what existing theories and premises tell you and try and understand what the world as it confronts you is telling you. So with that as a sort of a rationale for the way I look at this problem, I want to introduce you to someone. I wanted to introduce you to someone who I'll call Raj. I'll protect his anonymity. Now, I met Raj a few years ago in a village north of Delhi. Raj wasn't starving. I sat down with him and I asked him to tell me his life story. He offered me a cup of tea and a biscuit. But Raj was undernourished nonetheless. I've got my field notes here from that day north of Delhi when I talked to Raj. Let me just read out some excerpts from that. Raj is a man in his 40s. His mother died when he was an infant. His childhood was defined by hard-scrabble existence. His father had 2 hectares, but without any access to irrigation, he was held mercy to the annual monsoon. Raj remembers that in the mud house of his childhood, his regular meal would be chapatis with chutney. Fresh fruit and vegetables were eaten only when he and his brothers were able to steal some from the fields of local landowners. Sometimes for 2 or 3 days, the family would eat only 1 meal a day, which would be chapatis with salt. He never attended a day of school in his life and is completely illiterate. While in his 20s, Raj's father passed away. Family squabbles over inheritance ensued and the family's land was lost. Raj worked as a field labourer but is now too frail for heavy duties, so does a few odd jobs for a local landowner in exchange for which he gets grazing rights for his buffalo, the milk from which is his only major source of protein. Raj and his wife survive on a monotonous daily diet of chapati, chutney, milk from his family buffalo, tea, sugar and biscuits. Sometimes they get potatoes from local landowners as a gift. But basically, very rarely do they eat any fresh vegetables, fruit, lentils or chickpeas, key sources of protein and iron in vegetarian India. Now, Mary Robinson, the former President of Ireland and UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, has said the challenge in this area is to understand these issues in the same way those experiencing them do. I think it's important to take time out and listen to the life stories of people like Raj, because when we do, we start thinking about the world food problem in a very different way. In fact, I'd argue that we start thinking about it in terms of it not being about food at all. We start thinking about it in terms of just three concepts: livelihoods, capabilities, and entitlements. Now, livelihoods are important because the planet already grows enough food to feed everyone. It's just that some people don't have the income or the resources to gain access to that food. Back in 1998, the Indian economist Amartya Sen won the Nobel Prize in Economics for saying this. Sen was born in what is now Bangladesh, and he was a first-hand witness to two famines during the 20th century, the Great Bengal Famine of 1943 and the famine in Bangladesh in the early 1970s, just after Bangladesh's independence. The common presumption for both of these famines was that they were caused by calamities: a cyclone in the 1940s, floods in the 1970s. According to the prevailing wisdom, these natural events decimated food production and famine ensued. But Sen went back to the historical record. He looked at the detail of who was recorded as dying from starvation, and he came up with an alternative hypothesis that's now been widely accepted through academic research. What Sen argued was that the cyclone and the famine were mere triggers that set in train a wider set of socio-economic changes, and it was those changes and events, not the calamities themselves, that caused famine. What he found, for example, and think about this, is that the people who were starving from famine were not farmers because their crops failed. In fact, the historical records said that the natural events didn't reduce food production by too much. The people who were dying from starvation were rural workers whose livelihood was disrupted. And they didn't have the income or the means anymore to access the food that more or less was still in shops, markets and warehouses across the country. Fast forward to the present day. How many times have you heard someone say the problem with the way to solve the world food problem is to get farmers in the developing world to be better farmers, to grow more efficiently? Now, as I said before, agricultural research is vitally important. We need more of it. I would never argue otherwise. But what I'd say is of more immediate importance is for us to understand the processes by which people in the developing world have livelihood strategies that connect them to the food in their plates. Typically in the developing world, a household will have a range of livelihood strategies for this purpose. This might involve growing some fruit and vegetables in a kitchen garden or perhaps in a small plot of land, doing some work in the local labour market in a town or village, and perhaps relying on remittances sent from a family member living elsewhere. That latter issue is increasingly important throughout the developing world. Now, the challenge is to understand the nuance of these different livelihood sources. Because if we do that, we can identify the appropriate points of intervention in policy to best safeguard people's ability to access food. So if securing livelihoods is the aim, then I think the next issue we have to confront is, what does economic growth play in this agenda? It seems to me that economic growth is very important, but will deliver the kind of outcomes we want only if people have the capabilities to share in that growth. Here I'll draw on my research in India. India's been called a food security enigma. For the past decade or more, it's experienced very rapid economic growth. But this has led to only a marginal shift in the overall level of undernutrition across the country. This is quite different to what's happened in other countries in Asia, places like China and Indonesia, where we've seen rapid GDP growth on the one hand and quite dramatic falls in undernutrition on the other. So what's happened in India? Well, in India, what's happened is that the way economic growth has occurred, the chief beneficiaries have been people living in cities and people with skill sets, notably education, which has allowed them to stake a claim in the new economy. India's food insecure population mainly live in rural areas and have low levels of formal education. The result of this is what we call, as a food security researcher, a vicious cycle of unfreedoms. What this means is that people don't have the liberties to pursue the kind of life options they might otherwise have. And this vicious circle begins in the womb. If you don't have nutrients flowing through your body at an early age, your brain doesn't develop, your body is weaker. This then ricochets later in life to mean that it's harder for you to learn at school and harder for you to hold down a job. So food needs to be understood as a foundational source of deprivation, which then can add to other forms of deprivation later in life. And if this pattern continues in a vicious cycle kind of way, it means economic growth will routinely not include a large range of the population. Finally, I want to talk about entitlements. The right to food is a basic human right. It's encoded in United Nations obligations of different kinds. Nowadays, it's getting increasingly difficult for governments to ignore this. Again, let me refer to India. Let me tell you what's happening right now in India. There is legislation in front of the National Parliament which will make the government of India legally liable to provide food to its citizenry. The legislation is complex, as legislation tends to be, but essentially this will mean that 70% of the Indian population will be entitled to at least 5 kilograms of food grains per person per month. And this is it, if this is not delivered, action can be taken through the courts to ensure that it is. This is a game changer in the sense of the way the politics of food is going to be played out in India. And if India is the country with the most undernourished people in the world, it has global significance, of course. So let's go back to Raj. We can retell Raj's story through the prisms of livelihoods, capabilities, and entitlements. Raj is in the state he is because he had a parent die young, he lost his land. That curtailed his livelihood options. He lives only a couple of hours away from Delhi, a booming city, but a frail man, an illiterate man, doesn't have the skill sets, the capabilities to participate in that new economy. And finally, Raj, and all too many people like him across both India and the developing world, for these people, the right to food has been something on UN pieces of paper that have had no meaning in their lives. Hopefully, with this new legislation in India and related reforms, this will change. So to conclude, in a world where progress against hunger is failing for far too many people still, our solutions need to come from the bottom up. This is a problem not about food, but of justice. We need to listen to people at the front line of this burden, and we need to change the world based on what their experiences are telling us. Thank you very much.